Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Let's talk about the types of grief. Normal grief is defined as the ability to move towards the acceptance of your loss. People experiencing normal grief can continue to function in their basic daily personal and professional lives. And normal grief is usually accompanied by a gradual reduction in the intensity of the emotions felt. Anticipatory grief, as the name suggests, is the type of grief reaction you have to the anticipated death of your loved one who's suffering from a terminal illness. Anticipatory grief begins soon after the person's diagnosis and intensifies once the person's health begins to deteriorate. Anticipatory grief predominantly comes with emotions of feelings of regret for not having done enough for or with the person, or those of loss, thinking about life without the person. It is important in this type of grief to find closure while your loved one is still alive, to be able to cope with their death later. Normal grief that is complicated by other factors is called complicated grief. Now, these factors could be substance use issues, mental health disorders, or physical illnesses. Complicated grief is not only longer, it is also more severe and significantly impairs the person's functioning of daily activities. In delayed grief, grief symptoms and reactions aren't experienced until long after a person's death than is usual and expected. This occurs when the griever consciously or subconsciously avoids the reality and pain of the loss. Suppression of grief in the initial period leads to rebound delayed grief. Chronic or prolonged grief is a relentless grief that does not get better with time. The griever makes no progress despite there being a significant passage of time since the loss of their loved one. Chronic grief occurs when the nature of death is unusual. The death could be sudden, it could be violent, or there could be multiple deaths in the family. This is also more likely to happen when the griever has been completely emotionally and financially dependent on the lost individual. The griever falls into the trap of fantasizing about reunion with their lost loved one and becomes completely out of touch with the reality of life and its challenges. Chronic or prolonged grief must be treated because it has the potential to develop into severe clinical depression with self-harm and suicidal tendencies. Sometimes grief manifests with extreme, intense, or atypical reactions to a loss. This is known as distorted grief. These odd changes in behavior occur because of extreme feelings of guilt or anger, leading to hostility towards a person or self-destructive behaviors. Distorted guilt occurs in individuals who are perplexed by their loss and are not able to completely process the loss of their loved ones. This leads to a confused, unpredictable state of mind. Cumulative grief occurs when one experiences a second loss while still grieving a first loss. This is also known as bereavement overload or grief overload. Cumulative grief can be particularly stressful because you're not able to properly grieve one loss before experiencing the next one. Cumulative grief is common in cases of environmental crises, wars, and acts of terrorism. Normal grief responses that intensify and worsen as time goes on become exaggerated grief. This can lead to self-destructive behavior such as excessive substance use and suicidal thoughts, and even the emergence of psychiatric disorders that were never present earlier. Exaggerated grief is a kind of chronic grief and does need to be treated. Disenfranchised grief is a kind of grief experienced after a loss, but society at large does not acknowledge the importance of this loss in the person's life. Moreover, the person may be made to feel that their loss is invalidated and insignificant. Disenfranchised grief occurs when the death is considered to be the victim's fault. For instance, in cases of drunk driving, suicide, drug overdose, or in cases of HIV and AIDS complications. The relationship is considered to be inappropriate or insignificant, such as the death of a pet, a miscarriage, an ex-co-worker, or an ex-spouse, or if the relationship is considered to be taboo and thus stigmatized by society as a whole, such as in cases of a gang member, a same-sex partner, or a partner from an extramarital affair. Collective grief is felt by a collective group of people, from a small collective such as a community, society, or village, to a large collective such as a nation or a continent. Collective grief follows mass deaths resulting from a natural disaster, a war, acts of terrorism, or the death of a public figure. A very classical example of collective grief would be what nations are suffering from after the coronavirus pandemic. Abbreviated grief is a short-lived grief response. This kind of grief happens when there is little to no attachment to the deceased person, when the role of the deceased person is immediately replaced by something or someone else, or when the griever is able to accept their loss in cases of anticipatory grief. And lastly, absent grief. Sometimes a griever will not show any signs of grief whatsoever. He or she acts as though nothing has happened. This can happen as a consequence of a shock and/or denial of their loss. Absent grief is an issue because it can come back with a vengeance. However, it is important for you to note that just because you can't see any overt signs of grief does not necessarily mean that the person isn't grieving. Okay, so this brings me to the end of this video. Stay tuned for the next video where I will be discussing the steps of how you can deal with grief. Have a great day ahead.